Think about what draws your attention to a particular person or subject. What do you notice about it or about them? Think of the characteristics, perhaps the personality, the situation, the behavior, the impact on you. What is it that draws your attention in and holds it there? And once it's captured your attention, what opinions do you form about it? Or what actions do you take as a result? The impact that it may have on you or others. Welcome to Time to Come Alive. My name is Valerie Hope. I'm your host. Each week I have the beautiful opportunity to connect you with someone who will bring us to be more conscious, more connected, and as a result, even more creative. And today I have a wonderful guest who will be joining me in just a moment. Before I do that, I want to remind you, go to www.timetocomealive.com if you want to make sure you get this episode and others straight into your inbox. Or you can also go to YouTube and subscribe, and you'll get pinged every time a new episode's available. You don't want to miss it. And this conversation is going to be very exciting, so you want to make sure you stay tuned for that. The guest I have today, Ingrid Gavshon. I'm so excited to have her here. I know Ingrid. It's been like 3 years since we initially met, Ingrid. And we met because I went to the University of California, Berkeley Executive Coaching Institute. And you are clearly a member of the faculty there. And our interactions there were not tons, but I did get an opportunity to see you facilitate and coach me and others. What I found so fascinating about you is that you say so little, but when you do, it speaks volumes. So that was the first clue that I'm like, oh, there's, still waters do run deep. That's number one. And then most recently, as we've had an opportunity to collaborate more and more, as I've joined part of the faculty, had an opportunity to actually learn more about you and your background. And it's fascinating. Ingrid, did you know you're a fascinating person?
Thank you. It's so nice of you to say so, but I had no idea.
Had no idea. Well, cool. Now, everybody else that you're watching, you'll see what I'm talking about in a moment. But Ingrid, that's what I know of you. That's what I really appreciate about you. I know one of the things that really stood out to me is learning about your filmmaking, that you are the founder of Angel Films, and you've done many documentary films. So first of all, welcome to Time to Come Alive. Thank you for saying yes to being on this side of the camera.
Thank you so much. Very excited.
Good, me too. What else should we know about you?
About me. I was born in South Africa, in a place called Pretoria, a very conservative city. Couldn't wait to get out. I then went to study in London and ended up staying for 15 years. I went home to South Africa in 1990 when President Mandela was released. And I thought it was time to go home again. And I was very privileged to be there, watching history unfold.
So tell us a little bit about that, because one, I've never been to South Africa, so it'd be interesting to hear from that perspective. But what is it like being born there? When you were there, what was life there for you like?
Well, I was very lucky. I was very privileged. I was born white and given apartheid and the hierarchy there, I had a very privileged upbringing. My parents were both pharmacists, and I went to a convent school, and my interactions with people outside of my small circle of friends at school and social was limited. And my first awareness of the real iniquities of apartheid was, I was quite young, and my mother was part of this group of women that used to take food for a feeding scheme to these people in what was called so very far out township, rural township outside of Pretoria called Walmansdal. And my mother and her friend would pile in these big, huge bags full of maize meal, what you call maize meal in this country, and powdered milk, and we'd go and deliver it once a month. And then that's when I saw the poverty, and that's when I saw how people were living. And people were living in sort of very, very small houses, sometimes made out of bricks, but more often sometimes made out of mud. And I'd see the kids didn't have shoes, and I'd see what kids with kwashiorkor, which is malnourishment, looked like. And that was my first sort of awareness of what, that there were more, that, I was aware of apartheid, but I wasn't really, it really hadn't dawned on me until those experiences.
And I imagine those people in the township you went to visit were Black?
They were Black.
Black. Did you understand or
poor,
did you know? I'm sorry, say?
and very, very poor.
Very poor. And did you know you were white at the time, or what was the awareness?
I knew that I was privileged, and I knew that I was growing up in a very unequal society. Even at 6 or 7, or I can't remember how old I was when I first went. But I knew, one was very aware that there was a tiered society. There were signs that would say non-whites on benches, or white Europeans only on benches, or in the post office, or the liquor store. There were different entrances for people. People, if you were non-white, or if you were Black or colored or Indian, you had to go to a different entrance, and that you'd had to talk to the person through a grill, whereas we could walk into a store. It was the same with the post office. And it was, there were no Black people in positions of being a teller, or being a, post office teller, or, being a cashier. And so it was very regulated, and it was very, and it was very obvious what was going on.
So I'm really curious about this, and I love asking people the question, when was the first time that you knew you were white and it mattered? And it sounds like that was it the same experience that you just described with your mom?
And I don't think I've ever thought about it. I guess I just always knew. I went to a school that was all white. There were one, I think, Japanese person, because Japanese people weren't classified as colored, but whereas Chinese people were. And so the system, you knew where you stood in the system. There was never a question of where you belonged. They had 32 layers of classification for people in South Africa. So not only were you white, colored, Indian, colored in South Africa is mixed race, Indian, but there were different categories as well. And the education system, if you were white, you got really good education. Even if it was a government school, you got much better education. And then the coloreds had it a next tier down, the Indians, then the coloreds, and then Black people. So it was very tiered, and it was very structured.
Now, when you said 32 different tiers, are you literally saying 32, or you just meant a lot?
No, there were 32 different categories. There were things called the pencil test, where they'd put a pencil in people's hair, and if the pencil stayed, then you would be reclassified. And people, it was a terrible, terrible system.
Wow. And so tell me a little bit about, you said your family grew up, you're fairly conservative. So for you, what does that mean, that you grew up in a conservative home?
No, I grew up in a conservative city.
City, okay.
My parents weren't that conservative.
Oh.
My parents were very aware. My father had fought in the Second World War. He'd fought alongside different people and different races, and he was definitely not conservative. My own family were not conservative. The town Pretoria I grew up in was very, very conservative. It was the seat of government. There's one of their 4 capitals in South Africa. Cape Town's one, Pretoria's another, and Pretoria was the seat of government, and it was very conservative. A lot of military camps there, and that was run out of thing. It was a predominantly Afrikaans speaking city, and we were English speaking.
So you never learned Afrikaans?
I learned Afrikaans very badly. Partly because I was a bad student, but partly also because I didn't like I didn't like what I was seeing around me.
What do you mean?
Well, you know, as I say, everywhere you went, everybody's had a maid or a housekeeper, however poor you were. And the woman would have nowhere to go in the afternoon when they had their lunch break or their break in the afternoon. And they would be sitting on the sides in front of people's homes. They'd be sitting on the grass under a tree, talking to other women. They didn't have their own lounge to invite people to where they stayed at the back of people's houses. They were always what's called servant quarters. And so one was very aware, and often they would be looking after white children, so the white children would be sitting with them on the lawn as they talked to their friends.
Interesting. But how is that tied to Afrikaans?
How's it tied to Afrikaans? Good question. You would, in Pretoria, you were English speaking, and there was a very small population, or you were Afrikaans speaking. So most of the shops, most of the stores were run by, you know, most of the government organizations were run by Afrikaans people. So you went to the post office, you went into any government office, it would be run by Afrikaans people. A lot of the people were Afrikaans. There were, of course, English-speaking stores, but most people spoke both languages.
Interesting. And what was the relationship like between the English-speaking population and those that were Afrikaans-speaking? Or the Afrikaners?
I think, in Pretoria, you had to speak both, you know, because everybody spoke both. I think in places like Johannesburg, it was much more English-speaking, and there was people had less exposure, I suppose, to people who spoke Afrikaans.
Ah, that's interesting. So for you growing up, what was life like? What kind of things did you do growing up? Activities? What type of, friendships? How do you spend your time?
How do I spend my time? I swam a lot. I loved swimming at the time. I learned to ride horses, but I was always a bit scared of them. So I was very happy when at 12 or 13, I didn't have to go horse riding on a Saturday morning.
You were made to? It's like obligatory horseback riding on Saturdays, like chores?
No, it wasn't a chore. It was, I think I enjoyed it. Others my parents wouldn't have forced me to go. My brother, I think, was really good at it. I don't think I was as good. I think he'd go galloping and I'd go cantering, you know, because I was a little bit more tentative. So, yeah. But we'd go to movies. There was no television in South Africa until 1976. So people would rent movies, actually reel-to-reel movies, and rent a projector, and they would play some of the latest movies that you weren't getting to see on the normal circuit, because it was a very conservative country and everything was controlled. So the movies you were shown were controlled, and there were often banned movies. I can't remember now what was banned, but we'd go and we'd sit at somebody's home in their lounge, and they'd have lots of chairs and the kids would sit in the front, and kind of we'd watch a movie and everyone would talk about it and stuff like
Movies that were banned by the government?
Movies that were banned. There was very heavy censorship in South Africa.
Whoa, interesting.
So there was a whole tier of movies that you could see that were rated. And as I said, there was no television, so we missed out on that. So, you know, I'd listen to a lot of records and would go to what we called socials, or sort of like parties, and would hear various music.
Seems like such a regulated life to have.
Completely.
And so how does that align with who you are now? Like thinking back to how that regulation impacted your own personality or your life. What impact did it have?
It boxed one one was very much boxed into a certain system, and you had to stay within the system, and you played within the lines. And that is why when I first went overseas when I was 6 or 7, my grandmother was very ill, and we spent two months in England, and I went to school there, and I absolutely loved it. There was no sitting at your desk and some teacher lecturing to you. Everyone sat around, you know, 4, 6 kids at a day, round together in a circle, and there was a lot more freedom, and I loved it. And that became my dream, my sort of North Star. I wanted to go and live in London. And I went again when I was 17, and I wanted to stay, and my parents said, no, come back and study. And then when I was 21, I went to London to study further. And so I was fulfilling my dream.
That's interesting. So this freedom that called out to you, it is, but I think it's so ironic because what you talk about, this very regulated community that you grew up in, you lived in, was far more regulated for those who were not privileged, right? So that were not white or colored or Indian or that. But yet you still felt quite oppressed, it sounds like. What would you have liked to experience? You were going to say something. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, we were very aware of what was happening. Like if you had somebody who did your garden living on your premises, or a housekeeper, and they happened to go and see a friend a block or two away, or even further up the road, or happened to go out without what was called their pass. They had to carry a passbook. Which was this book, and it had to be stamped that they were working for you, and they could only stay within the certain perimeter. And so then you'd get a knock on the door saying Rufus had been arrested, or you'd hear that so-and-so's housekeeper had been arrested, and that the parents had to go in the middle of the night or the next morning to bail them out. And so there was all this awareness of what was happening around you. So yes, I had all the freedom. And certainly, I think I used to look at Johannesburg as this like really, hip place to go and to have been brought up. And I was really upset that my parents, we were being brought up in Pretoria, which, as I say, was which felt much more restrictive.
Got that.
Just because you would see people in military uniforms, not with big guns or anything, not at that time anyway, but you were aware that you were in a much more conservative city.
Okay, so we're sitting at the Gavshon dinner table. What are you talking about as a family?
What are we talking about? Good question. It's a long time ago. My parents worked together, so there would be a lot of talk about work. We'd talk about school. We'd talk about what was coming up. What do we talk about? We talk about international events. I had an uncle who was a journalist in London, worked for AP and for UP, United Press. And we talk a lot about things that he was reporting back, because that was my dream, was to be a journalist like him. But he was like an international journalist, and he was going to Russia with Nixon and meeting Khrushchev and various things like that. And I just thought, well, I'll never be like that. I'll never be I never knew there was an intermediary step to get there. And so we talk a lot about those kind of things. We talk about what was happening internationally. We talk about what was happening in South Africa, but there was very little press on what was there was very, very little written in the press at the time about what was happening in South Africa.
Okay, so you have an uncle who's obviously jet setting and in the middle of all the juicy bits in international press, and you're watching banned films in someone's living room. So tell us about how you came to become a filmmaker. Like, how did all those things converge to create this documentary filmmaker?
Well, I was living in London and I was working as a photographer, and then I worked. I spent 5 years working for criminal lawyers, as a paralegal. And my dream was to get into film. My dream was to be a researcher in television. That was my dream.
A researcher?
A researcher in television.
What does that mean?
Oh, where you research, topics in news. There's a news story and you do the background research.
Okay.
That was my dream, because I had some friends who worked in television, and a lot of them were doing that. And I'd been offered an opportunity a couple of years before to work on a film, and I didn't have the courage to take the job because I had a stable job in law, and I didn't want to take it. And then I was talking to a friend who actually had grown up in South Africa. Her husband had been banned and thrown out of South Africa. He was working for an international news organization, and he'd been thrown out. And I was talking to one, and she said, "What do you really want to do?" And I said, "I really want to work in television." And she said, "Oh, okay. And so it was June 1989. It was the beginning of June 1989. And it was a beautiful summer's evening. And I was just sitting at home. I think I was watching television. And she phoned me and said, "Can you type?" And I said, "Yes, badly." And this is before the cheap computers. And I said, "Yes, badly." She said, "Well, get your sorry backside down here." And I got on my bicycle. It's 9 o'clock at night. And I cycled down to NBC News. And there I was put in a darkened room. And there was like probably 5 or 6 screens, big screens. And this footage was coming in from different broadcasters. And I had to just sit and I had to log the footage. So I had to put the time code, wide shot, close up, medium shot, whatever, and what I was seeing. And I was there for 5 days watching Tiananmen Square, watching the news footage, logging the news footage from Tiananmen Square. And that was my entry into television, because just after the massacre, I stopped. And the head of the bureau, this woman, came to me and said, "Do you know how to do research?" I took a deep breath and said, "Of course." And she said, "Great, because our researcher's going back on hiatus, back to America for 2 months for the summer. And we need a researcher." So I all of a sudden became a researcher, but it was all LexisNexis. The internet was the early days of the internet. And
I remember
LexisNexis.
Yeah.
And I had to get my head around where the pluses and the minuses went. And it was the most extraordinary, it was my dream come true.
Yeah.
It was my thing. And I will forever be grateful to my friend Ziggy DeVos for giving me that opportunity. And when I said to her, "Thank you," she said, "Listen, if it wasn't you doing it, it would have been me." But she gave me my break in television, and I have tried to pay it forward ever since, because she made somebody's dream come true. And I tried to get in before. And if I'd gone back to South Africa, I'm sure I would have, because I knew enough. My friends and family were all in television. So I would have found my way into television earlier if I'd gone back to South Africa earlier, but I hadn't gone. And so I was very, very, very grateful to her for this opportunity. And then I got to work on really interesting, very painful, that was very painful. And I got to work on the Lockerbie crash, looking on stories like that. And it was amazing. It was extraordinary. And I worked there. And then when Nelson Mandela was released, I thought, when I heard he was going to be released, they unbanned the ANC in 1989. And then I heard that Mandela was going to be released. And I thought, it's time to go home.
What was it about that particular moment that made you decide to go back?
Oh, I'd wanted to go back for a long time.
Okay.
But I had been going back to South Africa to visit my parents, my family. But I was very aware that there were conversations happening. People were involved in the struggle, helping people, doing things, and that I didn't know the codes. The codes, people spoke in code. People talked. There were hushed conversations in the bottom of people's gardens. People would arrive. There was stuff happening, and I didn't know. Certainly I wasn't party to what was happening, but there were a lot of my friends were involved in the struggle and helping in various ways. And so I didn't go back. And so this felt like the right time to go. I'd got my intro into television. I'd done this for like 18 months, and it was time to go back to South Africa.
All right, I just want to make sure I'm following here. So at this point, you were working at NBC. You're getting some, you're the researcher, right? So that job that you dreamed of, that you wanted to do, that you had no experience, but yet you said, yes, I do. You dreamt about it all your life. But then you found out that there's this movement happening and that you have friends and family involved apparently in this.
I've been aware for a long time about the movement that was happening. Living in England, I'd been tracking what was happening in South Africa because there was far more information on British television and British newspapers than was in South Africa. In South Africa, it was harder to find out. There was a newspaper started by my brother-in-law, Anton Harbour, and another man called Owen Manoyam, called the Daily Mail, and then became the Weekly Mail newspaper. And that was one of the first anti-apartheid newspapers in South Africa. And that started telling people what was really happening. And so I'd been aware for a long time, from 1976, when I sat every night with my uncle, my journalist uncle, and his family, watching what was unfolding in Soweto in 1976. And he really believed that this was the beginning of the end of apartheid. Unfortunately, it took until 1990 for it to really start being dismantled. And so that was when I really started finding out a lot more and seeing a lot more. So I've been aware all that time.
Okay, got it. But then there was something about Mandela being released that you felt, okay, I've been thinking about it, let's just do it. What were you hoping to do back home?
I'd hoped to get a job either at NBC or one of the television stations.
Okay, same thing, researcher?
Same thing, because I'd only worked as a researcher for 2 months at NBC, but then I started working on the desk, which was a different job. And the same woman came, I was at the airport. I decided in November, and I went back in February, just after Mandela was released, or March. I think I got back the first month. The same woman came to the airport. I was at the airport. I just checked my cat in. Was taking my cat back to South Africa. And she gave me a little scrap of paper with a man's name on. And she said, well, I gave him your name and he may phone you. He's looking for a researcher. He's doing something on Black churches in South Africa. And I went, okay. And I got back to South Africa, and that afternoon went to this organization called Race Relations, South African Institute of Race Relations, and started doing research on Black churches, because I knew very little, and other than what I'd seen growing up. And so I had this huge stack of photocopies. There's no internet. And I read it all, and then about 4 or 5 days later, this man who was working for Dutch television phoned me and said, I'm only phoning you because Ziggy was so insistent, because I've already chosen the researcher that I'm going to work with.
Oh, no.
And so I said, yes. And I said, oh, it's so fascinating. And there's this and that. And I'm quoting figures and facts. And I overwhelmed this poor man. And he said, okay. Phoned back the next day and he said, would you like to work on this film with me? And that was my entree into documentary films. I'd worked on one smaller documentary the year before. I'd come back to South Africa and worked about this very radical Afrikaans musician, very left-wing Afrikaans musician who his music was banned by the government, and they were constantly saying that his music was the devil's music, and if you played it backwards, there were messages on and stuff like that. So I'd worked on this film about him for Dutch television, and then this man came, and that was my entree into television, into documentary filmmaking in South Africa. So within 2 weeks of getting back, I had my first job in television.
That was so, how did you know to be so strategic, Ingrid? That I think is so phenomenal. How did you know to do that?
I didn't. It was just, I wanted this job. I wanted to do this.
So before you even got a phone call, you're like, I'm going to start research today. And just being,
yeah.
It's
well,
I drew it to you.
Yes, well, she'd already opened the door for me to get this fantastic job at NBC. I had other friends who worked in television in London, and they wouldn't or couldn't or didn't help. And she had only known me a few months, but opened the door for me. And yet again, she was opening the door, and for which I'm forever grateful.
Bless her heart. Wow. Okay, so now I'm seeing a bit of a pattern here because you clearly you're like not, I wouldn't say revolutionary, maybe not quite yet. Maybe there's a little bit of part of your history that goes into that more, but it sounds like you're really drawn in by some of the tougher topics, the ones that didn't seem to be that well known or that well researched. So what was it about those particular projects that drew your attention that you'd want to go above and beyond to be a part of?
And because I hadn't been involved in the struggle against apartheid in any way, I wanted to try and highlight the inequalities of what life was like in South Africa. And even though there was a change of government, it didn't mean that things got better for everybody. And I was drawn to tell stories about what was really happening.
What was really?
So what was, I mean, I'd worked through this man, Dolph Reimers, at the KRO, the Katholike Radio Omroep. I got to work with him on a number of films, I think on 3 or 4 films, both in India and in South Africa. And he introduced me to someone from another television station in Holland called Icon, I-K-O-N. And I met the guy, he came out to South Africa, and I became a stringer. And so I was constantly looking for stories to send to him. So there was a terrible massacre where 32 people were killed in a place called Boipatong in the early 90s. And so I would send a fax to Holland saying this and this has happened, you know, and this is the story, suggest a story. And I always send them like each week, like 5 or 10 ideas for stories. And these poor people, I mean, they just like, and I was very lucky that they said yes to a lot of them. And so I went and spent a weekend in a hostel by the people that were committing the violence against ANC were government sponsored, and they were called the IFP, the Inkatha Freedom Party. So I went and I just read a little comment in the letters page saying, why are you treating us, we are living in these hostels and you treat us like we are animals in cages. And so I sent that, and I went and spent a weekend in this hostel filming these men and these women who had fled the violence and were living in the hostel with these men, and telling another side of from another point of view, always trying to look from another point of view. So I had made a piece about this massacre in Boipatong, and then 2 weeks later went to this hostel. And so I was always looking for stories that would help people outside of South Africa illustrate what was really happening and help get the word out. Because this was before Mandela came to power. This massacre was before Mandela came to power. And he almost called off the talks because of it. You know, because there was a betrayal of what he was negotiating with F.W. de Klerk.
So it's like, yeah, you were searching for the untold stories, it sounds like. When you said the word stringer earlier, what does stringer mean?
I was like a freelancer for this company. They were paying me to be their representative in South Africa. And I would feed them stories, and then they would, you know, and I would give them the stories, and then would make this, you know, make the pieces for them.
Ah, okay. So you were not just feeding them the story; you were actually the one then producing the story.
Yeah.
So at what point,
directing the stories, yeah.
really? At what point did that switch from being a researcher to actually the one like directing and producing and writing it?
So I worked for this man Dolph we did 2 films in 1990 in South Africa. And then I met this man probably the next year. And so I was freelance. I was a freelancer, and I was working for various television stations. People would either say, oh, look, so-and-so needs a researcher, or they need a producer on this story. And I was doing all of that. And then can't remember the year. I think it was 1990. I can't remember, 93, 94. The same broadcaster, I gave him an idea of making some films about these musicians and artists, black artists in South Africa. And so I made some short, like 10-minute films. One was about quite a well-known musician called Vusi Mahlasela. He's quite well-known internationally.
Mm-hmm.
And I made a small film about him. And then I made one about an artist called Bonnie and Charlie, who was this amazing woman in this deep, deep rural area called KwaZulu-Natal. And she had polio as a child, so she had a gammy leg. And so she couldn't work in the fields. And she was working for this potter ceramicist. And she started taking that leftover clay and making these figures, these beautiful figures, and started painting them. Mm-hmm. And this woman realized that she was really talented and started training her. And then eventually this grew into a whole thing called Ardmore Farm. And the workers also a lot of people from the surrounding areas became ceramicists. So they made the plates, made the teapots, made the jugs. Anyway, I made a film about Bonnie and Charlie. I made these beautiful, fantastical sculptures of usually biblical scenes, but they were multi-layered, all out of clay, huge, like sometimes 5 foot tall, 4 foot tall, 5 foot tall. And so I made a film about her, and then a couple of other films as well. And then in 1994, I think it was, I made a film about Holocaust survivors who came to South Africa after the war. And I paralleled that to what had happened in Germany to what had happened in South Africa. So I compared it with the sort of Nuremberg laws. And the premise of the film was, did people see similarities to apartheid? And most of the people I interviewed said no. Only one person saw the parallels, which I was quite surprised about.
Why did it surprise you?
Because I thought maybe I had this notion that people having managed to survive the Holocaust would come to a country and see the inequalities and see the similarities, and the people being tortured and killed and maimed and damaged and banished to certain very poor areas of the country, while the main dominant race, the white people, were taking people's lands, taking people's homes, appropriating things, and putting people into servitude.
And they didn't see that. So what did they see?
They said it wasn't comparable. And I was surprised.
Interesting. So of all the types of films that you've made and the different stories that you created, which ones seem to have sat the longest with you or impacted you the most?
There are a couple. One I made about a man called Duma Kumalo. He was one of what are called the Sharpeville Six. There had been a whole crowd of people protesting, and a lot of people were sort of rounded up and arrested because the town councillor's house was set on fire and he was killed. And Duma, who'd been a teacher, studying teaching, was one of the 6 people arrested. And I met him. I was doing a film for Discovery Channel about Robben Island and Nelson Mandela. And I met him, and I was really impressed. And we became very, very close friends. And I asked to tell his story. And he had got a reprieve. He got a reprieve and had been let out of prison, but he'd almost been hanged twice. And he was given a reprieve at the last minute, both times. And so I made a film about him. It was primarily about him, but he insisted that I interview the other 5 people, of which 4 agreed to be filmed, 1 didn't. And that sat with me about being on death row. And there's so many similarities here where people are on death row for years and years and years, and how people are treated, and hearing the songs as people are taken to the gallows. And that still sits with me now. And unfortunately came out of prison, and he was working for an organization that was highlighting a number of issues in South Africa, and he died of a heart attack, and terribly. That's the one film. And then the other film, I made a film. I had shown my films at this film festival in Holland called IDFA, and they came to me and said, we've got a fund, a Stop AIDS Now fund, and we're approaching women filmmakers and to put in proposals for a film about HIV and AIDS. And I'd made many films about HIV and AIDS. I made, I think, about 9 or 10.
Wow.
And, you know, short films, longer films, I'd made for various films over the years. And I'd been at a conference with a friend, and I'd heard this man talking. He was a teacher in a deep rural area, about how a teacher and a preacher, and how there were so many AIDS orphans whose parents had died of HIV. And I was talking to him about it, and we sat next to each other at lunch, and I was talking to him about it, and he told me about this one particular family that really touched him. He said most families had a sister, a brother, somebody, a family member, somewhere, even if they were living in the city, sending money back or keeping an eye out for these kids, but nobody was keeping out. This one family. And then, you know, 6 or 9 months later, I got this email saying, you know, we're going to have this fund. And so I went and I met him, and he introduced me to half a dozen families, and they all had stories. Any one of them would made a really strong film. But then he took me to meet this child. Her name was Nakiwe, and she was kind of monosyllabic pretty much, but there was something about her. She had this aura about her that I was very drawn to. And in her yard, it was her and her 2 brothers living there. She was then 14, and the 2 brothers were 11 and 9. And all the kids were swinging off this huge tree in their yard, and it was just like brown earth and this very basic house with, you know, 3-roomed house, no toilet. And I walked into the house, and there was this jar of maize meal, and it had cockroaches in it, and there were cockroaches on the floor, and there were flies, and the kids had torn clothes, and she was wearing a dress, but it was really short, and clearly she had outgrown. And the little boy had, I don't know if he had scurvy, but he had like bumps on his skin and sort of running nose, snotty nose. And the other kid was, I don't know where he was, but these kids were like really happy playing in this backyard together, all the neighborhood kids. And so I just filmed it and sent a VHS to Holland, and I was chosen to make the film. And I spent a year filming, going back and forth filming. And it was really, really hard. I'd always take food, and that's, as a documentary filmmaker, you don't intervene with your subjects. But I could not stand by and not leave these children food. And it was Nakiwe's birthday, and I bought her a jacket. And I was criticized by the filmmaking community for doing that, but I could not stand by. And for years afterwards, I supported the family. And then unfortunately, the little boy got TB. I was out of the country filming, and he got TB and was discharged from hospital and passed away. So that sits with me still. And I've been back to see Nakiwe. She now has a twin, and they are probably about 9 now, I suppose.
Wow.
It doesn't speak English, and it's very hard to keep in touch with her.
Okay.
So when I come, I go back to her house, because she doesn't live there, she lives with her boyfriend. And somebody goes and finds her for me. But I had tried to intervene. I tried to get her to finish school. I tried to get her to learn English, but she never did, because I would, she wanted to be a nurse. That was her dream. And I said I would pay for her to go to nursing school. But then she got pregnant at like 17. So.
And Ingrid, I'm curious because clearly you had a commitment, right, to tell the stories of the untold, the things that people were not speaking of. What were some of the things that you showed in the films that you made that was in your voice? Like, what was it that you wanted to say through these films?
I wanted to highlight people's lives and let people make, yes, all my films have a point of view, but I wanted people to tell their own stories, and I wanted to highlight various issues that were happening in South Africa. So I made a lot of, for Dutch television, I made films about violence and violence between the taxi companies were at war with each other, and there would be shootouts and taxi drivers be killed, and there were different routes. People had different routes and they'd very much be protective of it. And it was turf wars. And so I made films like that for the Dutch. These were shorter films. They'd either be like 12, 15, 20-minute films. And then I made longer films that I raised money to make. I wanted to tell the history. A lot of my films are historical. A lot of my films have got a lot of history and a lot of archive in it because they are historical. And I wanted to record history because I feel like history is not being recorded in South Africa.
When you look at, so now you live in California, you're here in the US. When you look at what's happening now around you through your filmmaker lens, what story would you want to tell that you haven't been hearing enough about?
What story? I would like to help other people tell their stories. It's not for me, and it's not my point of view to tell Black Lives Matter stories, or stories of immigration, or stories of inequality. But I would like to help other people tell those stories. I would like to help other people find their voice. Or I'm not find their voice, that's wrong. I'd like other people, help them amplify their voice and help other people hear their stories. I think people have got a voice and people are using it now, but it's more a question of what can I do to help others hear one another, have these dialogues, the intersections.
Yeah. Oh, I totally get that. So being able to give people a megaphone, if you will, or an opportunity to share what they do want to share that they haven't had a chance to. And when you think about the next iteration of Ingrid, there's so many things that you've already done and so many things that you are currently doing. What is that next step?
I'm searching. I'm not sure. I'm loving the work I'm doing right now. I feel that I'm helping, as an executive coach, I'm helping people change lives. I love the work that we teach. I think it's changing people's lives. I think it's helping people find the best in themselves and the best in one another, be it their team, their organizations, their companies. So I love that work. And I want to amplify that and get that more known internationally, and help people have these dialogues through that work as well. I'm talking to an extraordinary man about telling his story. And I'm not sure where it'll go, and just early stages. But somewhere, maybe I'll make another film, maybe I'll write a book, maybe I'll try and help people find their voices and make sure that people hear one another. That's I feel is my next. Is how do I help people actually hear one another?
I get that. Well, talking about this extraordinary man, we didn't talk much about this particular person, and you've alluded several times to him. So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about your experience in filming Nelson Mandela's documentary. So share a little bit about that as we are beginning to wrap this up. What was that like, and what impact did it have on you or the people that you showed it to?
I am so honored that I got to make 13 films about Nelson Mandela. I produced and directed all of them. I produced all of them. I made a film about Nelson Mandela and his prosecutor. I brought them together.
His prostitute?
Prosecutor. No, no, no.
Oh my
No.
God. I was like, you did tell the
Prosecutor.
untold story. Ooh. Prosecutor. Got it.
Prosecutor. His prosecutor asked for the death penalty for him and his fellow Rivonia trialists. I brought them together and that was the first film I made about Nelson Mandela. And that was the most extraordinary experience. That was the most extraordinary experience. And because the prosecutor asked for the death penalty and the judge fortuitously didn't agree and go ahead with it. And then I had the opportunity to make a film for a museum in Cape Town about Mandela. And from that, I was also one of those synchronistic, is that the right word? Meetings at this film festival in Holland. I met the commissioning editor of the South African Broadcasting Corporation, and through that, I told her I had this idea to make another film about Mandela. And Mandela was really, really sick in 2010, just before, in 2004, Mandela was really ill. And they were very worried. They had no films on their shelves about Nelson Mandela. And so I had a meeting and told her what I'd done for this museum in Cape Town and how I'd had other people tell the story of Mandela, because they didn't want to go approach Mandela for a film. And I walked out of this meeting with her with 19 ideas. She said, just give them to me. I've got a board meeting tomorrow morning and I've got to talk about this. Make sure I've got it on my desk by 8 o'clock in the morning. So I worked through the night with my friend Sharon Court and came up with these 19 ideas. And that afternoon I had another meeting, and all of a sudden I was asked to make this series of films. They chose 13 topics. Some of them were short, like 7 minutes about Mandela and his clothes, but others were about Mandela in prison, Mandela, the Royal Revolutionary, who had gone up to Algeria and for training. A story that nobody really knows that much about it, that he was called the Pimpernel, the Black Pimpernel, and various other films about him, sort of a biography, Mandela and the woman in his life, Mandela on Robben Island, Mandela and his foundations. So it was probably the greatest honor in my life was to get to meet Nelson Mandela at various occasions, but also to make these films about him. Well, stories also about other parts of him that people didn't really know. Hearing that, his famous shirts were made by this one man in Pretoria, and we got to interview him. And I worked with a really talented team of filmmakers that on the series, and many of whom I'm still in touch with, and some of whom I still work with.
Wow. Ingrid, why do I have the feeling that there's so much more that you haven't had a chance to share than we had time for? My goodness, it's like a box within a box. It's like those Russian dolls. You're like that with your Lithuanian background. Perhaps that's that's hearkening to that. As we wrap up this conversation, is there anything that you haven't said or haven't asked that you'd like to share with us?
No, I just feel it's such a privilege to talk about myself. So thank you so much. I don't normally do this, and I don't normally talk to people about what I've done in my past. So I really appreciate the opportunity. And I hope that people will go and look at documentary films with a new eye and look at documentaries that they wouldn't normally look at. Documentaries about people who are other than them and different from them, or look at people with a different point of view and get to learn something.
That's lovely. I'll make sure to put some links if whatever you send me that people could then take a look at. Are there some other documentaries out there that you recommend, or documentary directors that you recommend to us?
There are many, many documentaries out there. The most powerful one I think that everybody should be looking at is 13th.
13th? Okay.
And probably the most powerful film that's out there at the moment is Just Mercy. Brian Stevenson is another one of my heroes, and I wish I had made the film about him, the documentary film about him.
What? Okay, I have. See now, we can't wrap this up. Now I have more questions, Ingrid. So what? Okay, I need to know this. So what is it about the topic, especially around race, that seems to be a theme with the films that you make? What is it about that particular topic, out of all the different things that are not spoken of enough or in enough detail, that's drawn you to it?
I think that when I first came to America, I mean, I've been coming to America since 1985, but I think in the last few years, when I saw 13th, I was so shocked and horrified by how little I knew and how little was being said. And I decided that I needed to inform myself and learn more. And I haven't read enough, and I don't know enough, and I would like to go to Montgomery, and I'd like to go on the various freedom trails and stuff like that. I'd like to see more. And the similarities to what happened in South Africa, and the man's inhumanity to man, and man's inability to inflict such pain on people and such lasting damage. And that's what moves me. And that's what makes me feel that I don't want to just sail through life on top of, a little boat on top of the water. Occasionally I have to dig deeper, and I don't know how to make a difference. All I can do is talk to people and maybe help other people talk to one another. And that's, and if I can change one person's mind, then I'll have succeeded. But I don't even hold out hope that I can do that.
I think you might surprise yourself. And I just want to acknowledge that commitment that you have to not only telling the untold stories, but also knowing that you're shining a light on a part of humanity that sometimes goes unnoticed or unacknowledged, that is can be so traumatic, right, for so many people. And in order to heal any scars or heal any injuries or heal any trauma, it must be confronted. Right? We need to look at the injury before you can treat it. Right? We need to see what the condition is in order for us to heal it. And so I just want to acknowledge the work that you do and your passion for it and your compassion to it as well, to be able to bring that healing through your stories. Thank you so much.
I am so touched and honored, and thank you.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. And I hope for all of you who've been listening, your pleasure too. I will definitely highlight as many links as you possibly can give me, Ingrid, for the films that you've done or those that you recommend that we all watch, for those of you who've been captivated as I have during this conversation. And please do subscribe to timetocomealive.com to get this interview straight in your inbox, or go to YouTube and also search for Connect to Joy, and you will be able to subscribe to YouTube channel and get this notification. Ingrid, thank you so much again for sharing of yourself. I know that we've only scratched the surface. We probably took like 2 of the dolls out of the out of the packaging, but that's okay. That's all right. There's more to come, I'm sure, and I'm so grateful to have you as part of my journey as well in what I'm doing, and also the work that we do together at Berkeley.
I look forward to working with you going forward on many other projects outside of this.
Very damn. Sounds like there might be something there. Very good.
It definitely is.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.